Hello, everyone. My name is Jonny Diamond, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be welcoming you to today's Brooklyn Book Fest panel with three fantastic writers. The name of this panel is I think we're alone now, and I hope we're not entirely alone here on the panel. And it has been my great pleasure to spend the last few weeks with these three writers via their wonderful books. And before I go any further, I really want to recommend to everyone watching, and I will stop in the middle of this conversation as it's happening, please buy these fantastic books. I'm talking about Salar Abdoh's Out of Mesopotamia, Chelsea Bieker's Godshot, and Andrew Krivak's The Bear. I've had a wonderful, engrossing time with them over the last month, and I highly recommend to everyone that you figure out where to buy these at your local indie, from your local indie, so go out and buy them. And so now I'm going to get to the books themselves, and then we're going to have brief readings from the writers. We'll introduce them, and we'll have a nice conversation. Also, I'm going to try to follow along via Crowdcast here on my phone. It might be slightly awkward, but we'll leave some time at the end for audience questions. So I'm going to start by saying that on the surface, these books seem very different. In Salar Abdoh's Out of Mesopotamia, the chaotic brutality of war exists in uncomfortably close parallel to the banality of authoritarian bureaucracy. Chelsea Bieker's Godshot zooms in close on the life of a teenage girl caught in the harrowing thrall of a would-be rain-making cult leader. And Andrew Krivak's The Bear tells the quiet, distant future story of what may or may not be the beginning of deep time beyond human consciousness. Despite the obvious differences in setting and scope, though, these novels do exist on a continuum, grappling as they do with how apocalypse, and all its varied manifestations, reveals to us our humanity, or in some cases, lack thereof. And what I've loved in particular about reading Salar and Chelsea's books back to back is how, if we understand apocalypse in its original sense, that of revelation, they serve as cautionary tales of what is in fact already happening to us, both around the world and at the margins of American life. I think we're all accustomed to dystopias and apocalypses as fantasy stories, as entertainment, but for many, the end times are already here and have been for a while. So I have asked the readers to get some brief readings ready, and we're going to go through those now. And up first will be Salar Abdoh, whose book is Out of Mesopotamia. And I will briefly read Salar's bio for you now. Salar Abdoh was born in Iran and splits his time between Tehran and New York City. He's the author of the novels Tehran at Twilight, The Poet Game, and Opium. And he's the editor of Tehran Noir. He teaches in the MFA program at the City College of New York. Out of Mesopotamia is his latest novel. And Salar, if you could now read a brief passage from your wonderful novel and maybe tell us a little bit about it before you do.
Sure. This is a novel about a journalist who finds himself covering the war, the latest war in the Middle East, in Iraq and Syria. And he crosses that line between journalism and being a combatant himself. And he also does other things back home, writes art reviews, writes film scripts. So his life really is this sort of parallel lives that you were just describing that can happen in these situations. The portion I'm going to be reading from is, there's a word that recurs in the novel. It's called mokab. A mokab is basically a place in these, and it's an Arabic word where a lot of combatants come to sort of chill out, after battle, in between going to places. Sometimes these mokabs are far from the front, sometimes they're quite close, and sometimes they're literally on that threshold of the front line where our protagonist is. So the word mokab, you will also hear it here, and I'll read about a page and a half from that and that landscape. One night at the mokab, while we prepared the morning breakfast for several men of the Ali Akbar Brigade, who had asked for the favor of billeting them for a day or two, I dug into my notebook and recalled that I'd only copied one single line from the Frenchman. A book is a large cemetery where on most tombs one can no longer read the faded names. Now, as I write these words, I realize that there are so many lost names to a life that the best one can do is to simplify, to not fret the act of forgetting. The soldiers in a platoon might remember every tick and oddity that one of theirs carried. But a fellow in a mokab is lucky to remember his own name after enough time has passed, let alone the names of the dead. One of them I'll remember, however, because the love we had was immediate. And he also happened to have the same name as the brigade we were hosting just then, Ali Akbar. He came in one day for tea, his hand-me-down shirt ridiculous and dangerous in its oversizedness for a crack sniper. He was rail thin, and his buddies, like him, were Iranians, volunteer dead guys. I had not spoken a word of Persian in weeks, not even with the fighting cleric who had taken me under his wing and brought me way up here to the last true front line left in Iraq. Those of us who wanted to fight on would have to move west, crossing the obsolete border back into Syria, and pretend we were still defending the holy places. We all knew it was no longer about that. It was about something else, something elemental having to do with adrenaline and revenge. I imagine hunters know something about it. We had been chased and at times humiliated, but now the tables had turned. Watch a man whom you finally caught and whom you know has killed a few dozen people, mostly civilians, just because he could, because even as recently as 1 week ago, he could afford to be judge and executioner, and because he's a piece of shit. Then examine his eyes as he does not even try to protest his innocence because he knows that you know. See the way he goes limp inside of himself. Observe him carefully while the gone insane among you, and maybe the odd sadist, turns up to beat the soles of this man's feet before they shoot him. And you'll also know never to dishonor a man beyond a certain edge. I don't know what that edge is, and I don't want to investigate it too deeply. I just want to tell this story without the encumbrance of all the names that I have forgotten already, because they'll all die anyway. Thank you.
Salar, thank you. That was fantastic. And to follow that, I'm going to ask Chelsea to read a section from Godshot, and I'll introduce you now quickly. Chelsea Bieker is a writer and novelist from California's Central Valley. She is the recipient of a Rona Jaffe Writers Foundation Award and a MacDowell Colony Fellowship. Her fiction and essays have been published in Granta, McSweeney's, Catapult, Electric Literature, and Joyland, among others. Bieker holds an MFA in creative writing from Portland State University, and Godshot is her first novel. And Chelsea, if you could tell us a tiny bit about the novel itself and then read a brief passage, that would be great. Thank you.
Thanks, Johnny. Yeah, so my book is called Godshot, and it's about many things. I think at the heart of the book is really about this young girl, this 14-year-old girl's kind of journey through motherlessness after her mother abandons her in this drought-stricken, just devastated, tiny Central California town. And she really has to wade through what's going on in the town, as far as there's a cult. It's really run by this cult. And their whole objective is to bring rain to the droughted land and restore the harvest and restore the land. And so it's about that. And then it's also about, what it means to have a mother who leaves you for this other life and doesn't return. So I would say that's kind of at the heart of it. And I'm just going to read about a paragraph from chapter 14. December, the sky grainy, begging for rain. The smoke from the fires had drifted out to the ocean by now, but I swore I could still smell it. The local news reported that temperatures in Peaches had reached record highs, while in neighboring towns mere miles away, there were cool downs, tule fog covers, low visibility on the highways. Kerman soil was said to be moist, and Fresno itself was chilly enough for a light jacket if you were going to walk down Christmas Tree Lane in the evening, but Peaches remained a desert wasteland. This was further proof that we were being tested, punished even for something grave. But how could it be, everyone wondered, when the town was made up of such fine believers, when we honored God certainly more than the people of the city? It was by this I knew something beyond human understanding was at work. I couldn't feel God's love for me now, and I couldn't feel his destiny, but something supernatural was boxing us in this eternal summer, and it was why I couldn't let go of my faith completely, even if I wanted to, even if it would have been easier. All I had to do was feel the heat bear down, burning an endless dryness into my body. No man could accomplish something like that. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Chelsea, thank you for that. And so finally, I'll introduce our next writer and reader. Andrew Krivak is the author of 3 novels, The Bear, which I'll read from now, The Signal Flame, a Chautauqua Prize finalist, and The Sojourn, a National Book Award finalist and winner of both the Chautauqua Prize and Dayton Literary Peace Prize. He lives with his wife and 3 children in Somerville, Massachusetts, and Jaffrey, New Hampshire, in the shadow of Mount Monadnock. Did I say that right, Andrew?
That's correct, Mount Monadnock.
Man, I'm getting it tonight, which inspired much of the landscape in The Bear. And now, Andrew, if you could tell us a tiny bit about the book and then read us a brief passage. Thanks.
Sure. So the novel really began years ago when I was trying to get my boys to sleep, and I told them a story about growing up in Pennsylvania when my father and I had lost our dog, Troy, in the woods, and a talking bear helped us find him. And they just seemed to love this story, even when they knew that, of course, bears didn't come and talk to the father and his son. We bought this place in New Hampshire in the shadow of Mount Monadnock, and I've known about Monadnock since reading Galway Kinnell's poems. He has a poem called "Hurting Flowers on Mount Monadnock," and there's a way in which the natural world about this place is so simple and yet so transcendental. Thoreau and Emerson knew that as well. And as I was after my second novel, I found out that the one thing I just really love to do is to write about nature. And I think I really took it back to growing up in Pennsylvania, in the woods of northeastern Pennsylvania. And so I started to think about a way in which I could come up with a story and write literary fiction in which I was really pushing the boundary of nature, almost as a protagonist itself. And I started this story about a man and a girl who were living off the land and not thinking yet about human extinction for myself. They were just living off the land. It was a coming of age story, a sort of journey narrative for the girl as they were separated, and a domestic waiting for the man. Narrative problems ensued, and I was out fishing one day, just trying to figure out how would I solve this problem. And I was just looking up at the mountain and thinking how beautiful this place must have been for the first peoples who were there. And then I just thought, what's it going to be like for the last? And I realized that the narrative problem was solved right there. And I rowed my boat back to the house, and I went up to my writing table, and I wrote this first paragraph. The last 2 were a girl and her father who lived along the old eastern range on the side of a mountain they called the mountain that stands alone. The man had come there with the woman when they were young and built a house out of timber, stones pulled from the ground, and mortar they made with a mix of mud and sand. It was set halfway up the mountain slope and looked out onto a lake ringed with birch trees and blueberry bushes that ripened in summer with great bunches of fruit the girl and her father would pick as the 2 floated along the shore in a canoe. From a small window in front of the house, the glass a gift the woman's parents had given to her after having received it themselves from the generation before, so precious a thing had it become as the skill for making it was lost and forgotten. The girl could see eagles catching fish in the shallows of an island that rose from the middle of the lake, and hear the cries of loons in the morning while her breakfast cooked over a hearth fire.
Andrew, thank you for that. And it's funny because I was going to start with you in terms of specific questions and then sort of work my way backwards to the start. And I was going to ask you if there had been a precipitating event or a moment or a mood or a place or a person that had inspired you, or I guess called you to write this kind of book. But you kind of spoke to that in your preamble. So I guess I am also curious about what it was like to inhabit this distant future time as a writer. And you have 3 kids, right?
Right.
And so obviously there's a father and a daughter in this narrative. What was it like to inhabit that space and then return to day-to-day existence? Because for me in your book, there is a kind of slow undernote of a kind of grief, at least there was for me. And so how the hell did you balance that with the bustle of daily life and the constant way we live now with news and information? What was that like?
Yeah, well, daily life definitely bustles. In some ways, it became a bit of a refuge for me. And in this way, so I'm always trying to teach my kids things that I think just basic stuff that they need to know. And they have a great curiosity about them. So, let them do the things they're doing contemporarily, but also say, hey, look, you should look at this, or look at how that works. Let's go look at that thing in the woods. And so, one thing I've really stuck with as a writer is there's this, when you think about time. So this book, what I'd hoped it would be is like take the beginning and the end and make the two of those almost the same, almost in a way of, if we were to go back to Genesis and Hebrew scripture, that notion of if the beginning were the first two in that myth, this one, it goes back to the last two. But time, ordinary time, isn't so much time as stuff that contains things that are mundane, but ordinal in the Latin of counting down. And so I just was thinking about that sense of ordinary time. And I think that's really what I find with my children, is that we're all just counting down. And not so much to some end so that it's depressing or we're waiting, for some end time, but it's both a coming of age and a counting down, and you can't really separate those two. And so writing The Bear became a place where I could almost be more specific in the things that I taught while at home and in real life. My children are teaching me as much as I'm about being a parent, as I'm trying to teach them how to, sew a button onto a shirt. So I think, to answer your question, for me, it was a kind of refuge, and each was a complement to the other. I didn't find myself wanting to get back to the book or desperately wanting to make sure my children learned this, how to make a bow or something. So
really quickly, before I jump to someone else, I am curious, has your eldest read The Bear yet?
My middle son has read The Bear. And my eldest is busy doing other things, other cool things. But you gotta let your kids do what they do. But my middle son read The Bear. My daughter read it too. She started it, and she stopped because it was too sad for her. So,
yeah, it's wonderfully sad, and I think for me, I found the space at the end of it a kind of enlarging space in terms of the end. But we'll get to that. All right, so now Chelsea, I have a question specifically for you, which is not entirely dissimilar from what I was talking to Andrew about. It was really hard to read Godshot over the last week, in the way it evokes or describes cult-like obedience, reality-denying fervor. It was hard to read all that and not connected to the news and a particular group of highly devoted people who've basically infected themselves with a deadly virus at the behest of a bizarrely charismatic leader. So I guess my question is, where would you situate Pastor Verne and his Gifts of the Spirit congregation in, let's call it the grand pantheon of American derangement? And then secondary to that, what do you think it is about end times, or the intimation of end times, that makes these guys so appealing?
Yeah, I think for me, in writing this book, a lot of what people want to know about is the cult, and why I was obsessed with cults and where I got this idea, and how these people in the book could be going along with such a crazy idea. Because it's the narrative of the story, the cult goes to some really horrifying depths to accomplish what they feel is their purpose. So for most of us, it seems unimaginable to go to those depths. And I was very curious in how that happens. And also just that it happens all the time. As you were just saying, in the news, we have this really recent story of something semi-similar where this group is really subscribing to a group think and going through with, an irreversible action. And I was curious in a fictional way how to really pinpoint what it is about faith, or what it is about these unseen motions that that swirl under the cult. You know, why do people go along with it? And I think that there has to be something to do with desperately wanting to have a purpose, to feel that your purpose is true, and then a pride that unfolds, you know, alongside the psychological grooming that happens, but also a pride that you don't want to have to look back over all these things you've done and say I was wrong. So it's almost this teetering, this sort of snowball effect where the things you might be doing are increasingly strange or intense or awful, but there's a commitment to it that unfolds. And when you see everyone around you doing it, it becomes a normal. So I think for me writing this book, it was important to explore those ideas of faith and how people can have faith in something that we can't see, faith in something that might not make sense at the outset, but yet seems to really be this force behind their actions. And yeah, I was just interested in that. Growing up in the church as well, interested in unpacking some of that and knowing really firsthand what it feels like actually to feel that you are right about something so big is this really addictive feeling almost. And so to put that in a fictional space was interesting to me.
Right, and it's certainly that idea or that shared faith in being right about something seems like a powerful agent for creating an in-group dynamic that I can imagine is very difficult to walk away from. I'm curious, the way the book is written and the way that it follows pretty closely the first person viewpoint of the protagonist. It almost seems, as you're getting into the world of the protagonist, that it is somehow apocalyptic, that there has been almost a specific event, even though I don't even know if that's true or not. And to me, how intentional was that stylistically and formally to kind of start with a particularly narrow view of this town in this valley, in this place that feels so separate from life elsewhere? And frankly, for a while, and I hadn't read much about it intentionally as I was getting into the book, it really did feel like there had been an end time event. How intentional was that? Was that ambiguity?
Yeah, I think it became important to me to create this sense that there had been a severing for this town that pulled it away from the rest of society. I think, you know, as you were talking, I was thinking about, I grew up in Fresno, California. And so the Central Valley is this agricultural, huge hub that supplies so much of the world's food. And growing up there, I knew that most of my classmates didn't really know that. We didn't really see that in our daily lives. We were right there, but yet there was such a disconnect between the land, the food, and then our individual lives. It was almost as if we could just have not even been there at all. You know, eating produce off the shelf from a totally different country when it's growing right in the backyard. But as I got older, that was interesting to me. My grandfather was a raisin farmer, so I did have some access to what was going on in that region. But if I hadn't, I think I would never have really known. And so I wanted in the book for this fictional town of Peaches to be extremely removed, almost to have its completely own ecosystem that is totally failing. You know, it talks about how in the bounds of just that county, the weather is different, the land is different, those crops are totally devastated. And in creating that sort of claustrophobia of the place, I was able to have a little bit more leeway, I think, with kind of amping up some of the geological devastation that's already happening there, that is happening and has been happening for a long time, that I think it's easy to ignore if you're living there even, although less easy these days with the fires. But I wanted to create that idea, that sense that something had already been tipped over that wasn't going to go back. The toothpaste isn't going to go back in the tube, so to speak. And it's very apparent in this town. They cannot ignore it anymore. Each individual life is affected suddenly. And that was interesting to me to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fascinating. And I alluded to the similarities to some extent between your book and Salar's book, the ways in which versions of apocalypse, versions of dystopia are in existence, happening all around the world from these very specific subjective viewpoints, obviously. And so yeah, Salar, I'm going to ask you a little bit about that. Particularly, you do an amazing, harrowing, compelling job of juxtaposing the banality of daily urban life, the kind of, answering emails, getting texts, when there are multiple war zones, close enough to major urban centers. And I actually have a couple of passages I want to read really quickly to the kind of get at what you're able to convey. And so the first one, everyone, buy this book and buy this book. Sorry to be coarse, but please, these are fantastic books. Buy them now, everyone watching. So I'll read briefly this passage. And this is obviously Saleh, the main character, the protagonist. Back then, in that geography, this virtual republic of Facebook was the river that connected the Arab warriors. They took pictures of themselves 5 minutes before dying, then 3 minutes before dying, if luck and bandwidth were with them. Their smile was making the rounds on the internet, immortalizing them just as they were about to leave the world. And so obviously in that passage, you're getting at the relationship we all have with the internet and digital flows of information and how it affects our lives. And then here, speaking more broadly of this whole phenomenon, the voice of Saleh, I do not know how to translate any of this. I do not know in how many worlds a person can live simultaneously before they lose themselves completely. There is not language enough to explain all of this. And so to get to a question, Salar, I suppose, that last passage I read about how we exist simultaneously in so many places seems particularly painfully relevant to our collective experience over the last year in terms of quarantines and pandemics and the way the world sort of is with us, so much with us, and we are yet separate from it. How does, and not to give anything away, but how does Saleh manage to navigate the juxtapositions at play here? Like at one point, he's in the middle of a firefight, basically, and he gets an email or a text, actually, I think, or an email asking him about, some story he has to work on. It's incredible. But does he manage to navigate it? Does he get through it? And if so, how does he do that?
I think he doesn't. I think it's very hard to do this. And one of the things I've been struck in the few weeks the book came out, people writing, a certain sort of a reader who may not necessarily connect with the literary parts of the book so much, but with just the pure war aspect of it. And it's like there's almost a brotherhood and a sisterhood across the planet of people who kind of been there and done that. And if you've been there and done that, it's a language. It's a language of silence in a way. And no, Saleh does not know how to negotiate it because there's really nothing to negotiate. He's just he's an observer of the ends of the earth, the ends that both of these two fabulous writers also describe in their own ways. And he has to negotiate that on a daily basis, because the way the 21st century is, especially with social media and distances being covered so easily, so quickly, I've spoken about this before. You can be literally be on the front lines one moment, and at the end of the afternoon, you can be in the next country, having a drink or sipping a cappuccino, and it can discombobulate you. And it's a universal thing. It's not exclusive to Saleh and those men, those militiamen who were there, but to the American soldiers coming back home, and many journalists and war photographers and documentarians I've known. It's a real thing, and I think some people, like some soldiers, handle it better. Like in the novel, Saleh describes running into this Iranian commando who had his whole unit had been killed and their heads cut off, and he had been thrown off fourth floor, and he survived in 3 weeks in a Moscow hospital. And when Saleh speaks to him, and a lot of this comes from my own personal experience, so changed a little bit. Sometimes you look at a man and you just don't see any PTSD in him. And Saleh describes that, if you sat this man down and try to, inject him with PTSD, it just would not catch. And then there are other guys who, they react in other ways. But ultimately, it's a very difficult thing to experience these things and to say you're okay, because you're never okay. These landscapes are not okay landscapes.
Yeah. I will say, I think Saleh is one of the most compelling, maybe not quite the right word, but an incredible character in the context of any kind of literature of war. And I find that there's something about your book which has maybe not been gotten across thus far in this conversation. It's very funny. There's all like remarkable dark humor throughout. And it reminds me, frankly, the combinations between the scenes of the war and then the scenes of bureaucracy and the banality of navigating that reminds me very much of some of my favorite Czech writers. All the way back to, the good soldier Zweig, and then forward to people like Skwaretsky and Ivan Klima, and it's left a tremendous impression on me as a book. And so now I'm going to very quickly just, in terms of awkward segues, take a quick look at my phone to see if there are any questions coming in. And if you're watching this, you're all watching this via Crowdcast, please ask your questions in the chat. As a two-screen person, one of my screens is a laptop and the other is a phone. So if you have questions for Chelsea or Andrew or Salar, please ask the questions in the chat.
Jonny, I wanted to mention something that Chelsea brought up that I thought was fascinating. This notion of you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. And I think there's a kind of, I think there's always a kind of hopeful optimism, but at the same, just with respect to the title of this panel, I think maybe one of the best things, so one of the most cautionary aspects of these tales are that there will come a time when time moves on and you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. I can't tell you how many times people have said to me, but there's someone else around, right? Like she meets somebody else, or, what about, someone's going to show up and humanity will go on. And the answer is no, it doesn't. It's twilight. It's the dusk. That's it. Lights out. And there's a sort of hubris in this idea that we can't ever get it wrong. It can't ever be the end. And I think that that hubris needs to be, or I think it's good to be checked every now and then with respect to that. So I don't know, Chelsea, if you were Salar as well, but I thought when you mentioned that, Chelsea, I thought, yeah, that's exactly right.
Well, that it's funny you bring that up, Andrew, because I had been curious about, respectively, all three of you, and this is an open question, if to some extent you see these books as hopeful at all, or to complicate that question, what role does hope have right now, as the world seems to accelerate a little bit towards a darker place? Chelsea, I'm going to ask you in terms of the hope question first.
Yeah. That is a great question. I think in my book, I wanted there to be an essence of hope at the end. Mainly, it wasn't so much that what had happened could be directly repaired. It was more that time would continue and things would continue changing, that things are always on this continuum, and that there would be more doors opening versus closing. I wanted there to be an expansiveness versus a retraction at the end of my book. And I think that's also probably my hope for this situation our world is in. I would hope that this time is actually the opening of a new door. I think we're all hoping that. And then this morning I was doing a outdoor yoga class, and the teacher was talking about this idea that suddenly it seems like humanity feels that in 2020 we've invented suffering, but truly suffering has always been here and has always been, this isn't the first time that the world has felt perhaps this dire, but it's the first time we're experiencing it. And it reminded me this idea of cycles, that we're all kind of on these cycles, and to say that I have a for sure hope for any one thing, I'm not sure, if everything feels so day to day, and I think the characters in my book would reflect that as well. But there is this feeling that we will keep trudging on with what we have left, and that's just humanity, right? My dad was in Vietnam, and actually, Salar, was really interested in what you were saying about PTSD. I've watched him really experience so much PTSD in his life, and I asked him, when you were in the war, what did you think was happening? You were so young. Did you think the world was ending? Did you think that you would never make it out? And he said, I just kept walking. I just kept going. And then it was over. It was such a simple thing, but I think it really got me through that day. It got me through, we're all having these difficult days as things are burning and maybe we can't go outside and there's smoke everywhere. It's like, I'm just going to keep walking. I'm just going to keep one foot in front of the other. That's all we can really do. I'm kind of trailing off now, but that's kind of what your question made me think of.
Well, yeah, and I think I suppose for me there's a difference between hope and the hopeful. The two are sort of different. One is something you continue to walk towards. And Salar, for you, I don't think most readers would take your book to be a hopeful book, but there is something in Saleh's stubborn, persistent kind of integrity in the face of so much that, for me at least as a reader, seemed like a kind of backdoor into hopefulness, and that's my reading of it. And I'm curious if you think of him as a man who kind of struggles with the curse of his own integrity in the context of so much that is so terrible.
Absolutely. He's coming from where he comes from. Iran has been under economic sanctions for about 4 decades, and the last 3 years, the toughest sanctions in history since World War II. So what happens in situations like these is when people of let's say a nation or a geographical space such as the Middle East, something happens, such as President Obama comes and makes rapprochement with this country, and then suddenly goods begin to flow away, and then there's hope. And I was there. I was in Freedom Square that night when we celebrated the nuclear deal with the United States. Even as I speak, I have goosebumps actually thinking of that night. And then within I don't know, a couple of years, with the changing of the guard in the United States, that hope was shot down. But it wasn't the first time that had happened. So it's for that particular country, as in many countries, it's been a roller coaster of hope and hopelessness, hope and hopelessness. But every time it happens, the bitterness seems to sort of linger and be added to. And nevertheless, one does not lose hope because as Chelsea brilliantly, her father put it, one just keeps on walking. You don't have another option. There is not a second option. That is your only option. And I've experienced that in those landscapes that Salar describes myself. And sometimes that not having an option is your hold on life.
Yeah, that's very well put. As a way that we all try to keep walking in the face of these things. And Andrew, I think that flows nicely into what is the driving force of the bear is essentially walking. And it's walking through seasons, it's walking through landscapes. And so I guess the question is for you, and your book is slightly different from both Chelsea and Salar's, obviously, insofar as they are describing versions of apocalypse of that which is revealed now, whereas yours is an entirely different atmosphere. But where do you locate hope in the narrative of the bear? Where do you locate hope for its protagonists and then for its protagonist?
Yeah, so I mean, I definitely wrote that the last line was a line of hope, of being born, and I think so. I love Chelsea mentioned the continuum, and the just keep walking reminds me of the old Buddhist story about the man who's just told to chop wood and carry water, and he does it for years. And when he says, "Okay, now will I be enlightened?" and he said, "Yes, chop wood and carry water," and that's what we do. But so, with respect to, there's, how can I say this? I think the continuum, when we see that it's bigger than we are, that's where the hope comes in. And then the hubris washes away. And then we can really begin to live in a now. I mean, I think one thing I really wanted the girl to live in, like she's in nature because she lives entirely in the now. Everything is about the moment. That to me is where the hope lives.
I mean, there's something incredibly compelling when she returns, and I don't think it's giving anything away. And her decision to slowly live outside rather in the old home, and that is an act of moving into a different kind of, it's not quite hope, but go ahead.
And ultimately, I mean, if the story is about storytelling, my hope was that story itself is where the hope is what lives on. And that trying to push the notion of the protagonist into nature was essentially a sort of fear not. The story will be told, there will be memory. And memory is ultimately what I think what we hope for, that being remembered.
Yeah. I feel like we're just getting warmed up a little bit, but technically we have 2 minutes. And I'm just going to double check there's any questions. No questions in the chat. So I think, I don't know, I like ending with this image, Andrew, that you've just evoked, and I was really moved by all 3 of your books, frankly. And it was a kind of incredible time to read them all the last month. And so I'm going to thank you all now for doing this. Thank the Brooklyn Book Fest. And I'm going to take one last opportunity to really, people watching this, these are fantastic books. Out of Mesopotamia, Salar Abdoh, Godshot by Chelsea Bieker, and finally, The Bear by Andrew Krivak. You guys, it's been a pleasure to talk with you, and maybe someday in the after times we can have a conversation like this in a much more human environment, and I won't look like I'm filming from an undisclosed location. You guys look great. You guys look great. But I can't thank you enough. We have 1 minute left. And so I hope, does anyone have any concluding thoughts?
I just want to
All
say
right.
thank you to all.
Great.
Thank you, Jonny. Thank you, Chelsea. Thank you, Salar.
Thank you all. I'm truly honored to be with you tonight.
All right. Well, hope to see you again soon. Thanks, everyone. Bye.